Hello and welcome to BlockOne Productions. My name is Soma and I am with Glitch the Husky. This is part 2 of my beginner series. Today we will create a patch from scratch and review some techniques on how to approach new modules. The first thing we need to do is to delete everything. I have a blank template with just the audio interface. To do that, we just need to click File and then Overwrite Template. And now we can write our patch. And for that, we're going to use one of the most interesting modules and one that seems really complicated at first. We are talking of course about Random Sampler by Audible Instruments. This is a recreation of the amazing Marbles by Mutable Instruments, an iconic brand of modules for Eurorack. I could talk about this module for hours, and it's really interesting and one of my favorites. But how are we going to use it? The first thing I recommend is that when you download any module, check for the tags. Things like oscillator and sequencer are pretty self-explanatory, but there are some weird combinations out there. Keep an eye for them. They can change your workflow. If you already have downloaded the module, you can right-click, and in the info section you can also check the tags. In this case, Random Sampler just says Random and Hardware Clone. Not much we can gather from that. In the same info section we have User Manual with Ctrl F1. In this case it will take us to mutableinstruments.net and to the user manual of Marbles. They are exactly the same, so don't worry. This manual explains extensively each and every function in Random Sampler, so you can read about it or you can experiment with it. Don't worry. The worst thing that can happen is that you crash VCV Rack and you can select an option to clear the patch and start over. Whenever I deal with new modules, I always have a button, a knob, and the scope ready to understand what kind of signal we need to work with. Also make sure you have Show Tooltips turned on in the View menu. And now Random Sampler has 8 knobs, all labeled. It has 2 buttons labeled T and X. 4 buttons next to 3 colored circles and 1 button next to the length knob. On the bottom we have 2 rows of CV ins and outs, and the bottom is grayed out. If we hover our cursor over this, we can see that they are CV outputs and the other ones are CV inputs. I don't know about you, but I like to go for the flashing light first. Let's connect them to our scope and we can see that they are gate signals. We know that because we get a square signal that it's always 10 volts when active and 0 volts when inactive. These gates can be used to trigger many things like sequencers, ADSRs, flip-flop switches, whatever. If we watch it carefully, these outputs are labeled T1 and 2 and 3. The middle one flashes constantly and the other lights flashes at the same beat, but they are exclusive. The rate at which these lights blink can be controlled using the rate knob or by using the clock input. Pretty self-explanatory. The bias knob can change the probability at which this module select either T1 or 2 output. To the left, it will choose more often the T1 output and to the right, the T2 output. The jitter function is really interesting. It adds some imperfections to our clock and you can use it to give a more human-like feel. Whenever I create ambient patches, the jitter function is really useful, but not so much for melodies that go with a steady drum beat. You should experiment with all these functions. On the right side of Marbles, we have 3 outputs labeled X, 1, 2, and 3. If we connect them to our scope, we can see that they send CV. And if we watch carefully, we can see that X1 changes the CV whenever T1 flashes. The same is true for X2 with T2 and X3 with T3. Using both T and X, we can generate amazing random melodies, and we will do so in a moment. This section has another clock input, a steps knob, a bias knob, and a spread knob. Let's start with the steps knob. We can see that it has 3 labels. If we move the knob, we can see that our signals go from smooth to a step output. If we manipulate the bias knob, we can see that our signal goes from low to high, meaning that it changes our central voltage or note. The spread knob changes the distance that new notes can vary from our central node. We can see it graphically in our scope, and here's a very useful graphic from the manual. Now the top section is really amazing. It's called Deja Vu, and you can probably guess what it does. It will take our current sequence from D or X or both and repeat it. You can select the length of this sequence, and the Deja Vu knob controls the probability of new notes or gates coming into our sequence. One thing that I love about mutable instruments, or audible instruments in this case, is that the knobs don't have a uniform behavior. In this case, the knob position from 7 o'clock to 12 o'clock results in completely random or a fixed loop, respectively. From 12 o'clock to 5 o'clock, the loop will be fixed, but the resulting sequence will jump within the loop, so we can have permutations of the same sequence. There are a lot of extra functions in marbles, just like the T and X mode that change the behavior of their number 1 and 3 outputs, but not from number 2. But that's for another video. If you want a full tutorial on marbles, just leave a comment. So we're going to be using marbles as a random sequencer to trigger the notes of a synth bass. For that we need an oscillator. I'm assuming you already know some basic terms of synths in general and sound design, but if you don't, again, just leave a comment. I'm going to use VCO from Rogue Audio because I love that brand. Let's connect X1, 2 or 3 to our Voct input in our VCO or note input, and let's use a saw output for our sound. We now have a sequence of notes, a sequence of gates, an oscillator making sounds, and now we need a VCA or voltage control amplifier. You could connect your VCO directly to the audio output, but we want to have more control over our sound, so let's use a VCA. I like the one from VCV because it's simple, polyphonic, and it has a graphical interface showing how our volume changes with our CV input. Let's connect our saw to the VCA, and if we connect the VCA to the output, it will give a constant signal. We can connect our T sections of the CV input for VCA, but gates are too short and boring. So let's use an envelope generator. I have two main options for envelope generators, ADSR by VCV or cèis by Instruo. I usually go with ADSR when using polyphonic cables, and with cèis when I am using triggers or gates that are way too short. In this case I'm going to be using cèis. Let's connect our T output and the CV output to the VCA. And now we have a much more interesting sound. Something that I really liked when working with the Prophet 5 is that it has another envelope generator that affects the cutoff of a filter. You can watch a tutorial on how to build it inside of VCV Rack in the link in the description. So let's take another cèis with the same T output and now select a filter. Again, there are lots of options, but I like Lateralus. It sounds great, has AV inputs for cutoff, resonance and drive, has 4 different outputs, and the name always reminds me of the band Tool. Let's connect the output from our VCA to the input of Lateralus, and the CV out from cèis to the cutoff CV input in Lateralus. And now we have a much more interesting sound. Back to marbles for a second. I want a bass sound, so let's change the steps knob almost all the way to the right, so it eliminates some notes from our scale. The bias to the left to lower our note. The spread also all the way to the left, so we have most of our notes in a range, and just the occasional note that goes higher than that. Right click in the module and we can select our scale. This is way easier in VCV Rack. In the physical audition you have to hold the button and press to select the scale, but here we just have to right click. We now have a generative bass line. Let's add a drum beat. I love uGraph. It's a drum sequencer that is also based on marbles. It has 3 trigger outputs and 3 accent outputs, but my favorite part are these map X and Y buttons. You can have lots of variation using an LFO and maybe a sample on hold. For now, let's connect our D2 to our clock input and turn it on. To produce our drum sounds, there are tons of options, like a sampler, a dedicated drum synth, or use another oscillator with a very short envelope. Let's use Pico Drums, a small module with lots and lots of drum samples already integrated, and with 2 trigger inputs. Perfect for what we need. Let's connect trigger 1 and 2 from uGraph to Pico Drums, and now we need a mixer. Let's use Mix 4. I always talk about this mixer, or rather it's a channel version, but let's use Mix 4 for now. Let's connect our filter to the first channel, Pico Drums to the second. And let's add V103 by Din3, a reverb and delay unit. I will be using the out from Pico Drums to give a little bit more depth to our drum sound. Let's connect V103 to our mixer, and now let's play with our sound. I like to have my patches adjusted, so let's do that and fill the space with this resizable blank. We now have a really interesting beat with a bass line. I could listen to it all day. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe and leave a comment. Follow me on social networks, join my Discord and stay tuned